What is the planet that stays closest to Earth the longest? Surely the first ones that come to mind are Mars, or if you are a fan of astronomy, maybe Venus. But would you believe me if I told you that it is neither? Although Venus and Mars have orbits that bring them very close to Earth at specific times, when we look at the orbits of all the planets in the solar system, we notice that one planet, although very small, seems to come closer to Earth than any other. That planet is nothing more and nothing less than Mercury? Yes, as you heard, neither Mars nor Venus. The closest planet to Earth is Mercury. In fact, the strangest thing is that Mercury is not only the closest planet to Earth, but also the closest planet to Neptune. How is that possible? But if Mercury is the closest planet to the Sun and Neptune the farthest, how is both planets are at the same time the closest to each other? Let's examine this controversial topic, and you'll understand what's really happening in the solar system. For decades, science fiction and space agency plans have told us the idea that Mars, the red planet, is our closest neighbor, a kind of Earth's younger brother waiting to be colonized. In terms of space exploration, it's undoubtedly the world we've studied the most after our own moon. We send multiple probes that map every corner of the surface, and rovers that move through different terrains to unmask every last secret that may be underground. Mars is famous for being the only planet humans could inhabit with the technology we envision for the near future, as it is, in some ways, the most Earth-like planet in terms of geology and day length, which is only about 40 minutes longer than ours. Unlike hellish worlds like Venus or gas giants beyond the asteroid belt like Jupiter or Saturn, Mars has a surface to walk on, and its gravity is 38% of Earth's. And as if that were not enough, there is evidence of ancient rivers, lakes, and oceans, and even perhaps, in some hidden corner, microbial life. But just because it's Earth-like doesn't mean it's the coldest. To understand why Mars isn't really the coldest planet, we must first examine the enormous variability in its distance from Earth. Mars and Earth share an interesting orbital relationship. Both revolve around the Sun in nearly circular orbits, but Mars does so at an average distance of about 142 million miles, while Earth does so at about 93 million miles. That means when both planets are on opposite sides of the Sun, they can be separated by more than 230 million miles. However, every 26 months, Earth and Mars come very close, and something astronomers call Mars opposition occurs when the Earth is positioned directly between the Sun and Mars, and both planets are at their closest approach, separated by about 34 million miles. This is the moment the space agencies like NASA take advantage of to send rovers and exploration slingshots to Mars, since it enables shorter, more efficient trajectories, saving fuel and significantly reducing travel time. But here's the catch. This closeness only occurs at particular times, not constantly. Mars only aligns that way with Earth every 26 months, and for the rest of the time, it's pretty far away. If we consider the distance over time, the average distance between Mars and Earth increases to 140 million miles. This difference is abysmal. Because the orbit of Mars is much broader and its transitional motion is slower than our planets, both worlds spend most of their time on opposite sides of the Sun, separated by an immense void. When the two planets are so far apart, it is impossible to send a spacecraft because they would take too long to reach them and would require enormous amounts of fuel. That's why, although Mars is the planet most similar to ours and can sometimes be very close to Earth, it's not the closest planet to Earth. And if it's not Mars, then which is it? If you ask any astronomy enthusiast what the closest planet to Earth is, the most common answer will undoubtedly be Venus. And from a purely geometric point of view, that answer makes sense. Venus is the planet whose orbit is closest to ours in the entire solar system. It orbits the Sun at an average distance of about 67 million miles, while the Earth orbits at 93 million miles. At its closest approach, what astronomers call an inferior conjunction, Venus can come within as little as 24 million miles of Earth, which is significantly less than the 34 million miles we mentioned about Mars. For this reason, many books, schools, and even documentaries have repeated for decades that Venus is the closest planet to Earth, and to some extent, they are right. Venus comes closer to Earth than any other planet during inferior conjunction. But what happens the rest of the time? Here's where the catch is. The minimum distance is not the same as the average distance. The inferior conjunction between Earth and Venus occurs approximately every 584 days, or about every 1.6 years. This means that although this day it passes, skimming the Earth, it does so very quickly, and once that encounter occurs at 24 million miles, it continues on its way, quickly moving away towards the other side of the Sun. When Venus is at the opposite point of its orbit with respect to us, the distance between the two planets shoots up to 162 million miles. This means that for most of the time, Venus is in fact incredibly far from Earth. In fact, if we were to track the distance between Earth and Venus daily for decades, we notice that a surprising amount of time passes at an average distance of about 105 million miles. This approach trap is what confuses most people. In this video, we're looking for the planet that spends the most time closest to Earth, not the one that comes closest to Earth. We always visualize the solar system as a static map, in which the orbits are concentric circles and the planets are aligned. But the planets are constantly moving at speeds of thousands of miles per hour. Venus is like a high-speed train passing through a station very close to ours. The tracks may be a few feet apart, but the train passes so fast that if we average its position over the course of a year, most of the time it will be anywhere else but at the station. At the end of the day, closeness should not be measured only by the peak of approach, but also by permanence. And it's precisely on this permanence metric that Venus loses the battle against a much smaller, often overlooked contender in school textbooks. Enjoy deep fact-check space stories? Hit subscribe and activate the notification bell. Otherwise, YouTube will not show you the next videos, and you'll miss what we uncover next. This is where everything you thought you knew about the solar system takes a 180-degree turn. Traditionally, when we talk about the closeness between planets, we think of their minimum distance or their orbital position with respect to the Sun. Since Venus has the closest orbit to Earth, it is assumed to be the closest planet. But that's true only during the inferior conjunction. What really matters is the average distance in time. That is, how close one planet is to the other over a long period, as if the distance were averaged over millions of days. In 2019, a group of engineers from the U.S. Army Research Laboratory and the University of Alabama proposed a new approach to calculating this, called the angular midpoint method. This method, instead of simply measuring the minimum or maximum distance between orbits, considers the relative positions of the planets along their paths around the Sun. That is, it averages the distance between them at all possible times. And when we analyze the average distance of all the planets from each other, the result is surprising. Mercury is on average only about 57 million miles from Earth, which is less than Venus's 105 million miles and far less than the 140 million miles of Mars. That is, on average, Mercury is the closest planet to Earth. But how does this happen? This is because, being the closest planet to the Sun, it has a compact. While Earth is at an average distance of 93 million miles from the Sun, Mercury stays in a much tighter circle of 36 million miles. What does this mean for us? It means that even when it's at its most distant point in its orbit, Mercury can never get too far from Earth. Although its closest approach to our world is about 48 million miles, which is technically farther away than the record of Venus or Mars, Mercury makes up for that lack of proximity peaks with unbeatable consistency. Think of it this way. Venus is like a friend who lives in another city and visits you once every 2 years. When it's at your house, it's the closest, but the rest of the time, it's hundreds of miles away. Mercury, on the other hand, is like a neighbor who lives in the apartment next door. He never enters your room, but he's always a few meters away, day after day, year after year. This revelation changes how we view celestial maps. Mercury may not be the planet that comes closest, but is without a doubt the one that spends the most time near us. But if the fact that Mercury is the closest planet to Earth seems incredible to you, what would you think if I told you that Mercury is not only the closest planet to Earth, but also the closest to Neptune? The revelation that Mercury is our closest neighbor is just the tip of the iceberg of an even more amazing astronomical phenomena. What happens to the Earth is not an exception or a coincidence of our position in the solar system. It is a mathematical rule that applies to all other worlds. If we did the same statistical exercise for Mars, Jupiter, or even the frigid and distant Neptune, the result would always be the same. Mercury is, on average, the closest planet to each of them. Why? This conclusion, which defies visual logic, is due to the angular midpoint method, or simply midpoints, we discussed earlier. This is a mathematical technique that is used to find the exact points of balance between two planets, considering three factors. 1. The average distance from the planet to the Sun. 2. The maximum distance between the two planets. 3. The minimum distance between the two planets. When we consider these values, something interesting happens. In a typical solar system image, it seems obvious that Neptune's neighbor is Uranus, since their orbits are next to each other. However, if we consider the maximum and minimum distances between the two, we realize that because Uranus and Neptune have such large orbits, they spend most of their very long years on opposite sides of the Sun, billions of miles apart. In other words, even though Uranus is Neptune's neighbor, when both planets are at opposite ends of the Sun, the maximum distance between them can be an astonishing 4.579 billion miles. Instead, the maximum possible distance between Neptune and Mercury is only 2.838 billion miles, much less than the maximum distance between Neptune and Uranus. That's why, although Neptune orbits 2.79 billion miles from the Sun, the average distance between Neptune and Mercury is slightly less than the average distance between Neptune and Uranus. And the same is true with Jupiter and Saturn, or with Mars and Venus. In all cases, Mercury is on average closer than its supposed immediate neighbors. While the gas giants move away from each other by distances that the mind can barely process, Mercury never moves away from its central position. This calculation technique has been validated by simulations that track the position of planets over thousands of years. And the data confirms that even the dwarf planet Pluto, which lies at the edge of the solar system about 3.67 billion miles from Earth, has Mercury as its closest neighbor. Thus, despite being the smallest planet and often the one that is least talked about, Mercury takes the throne of the planet closest to all others, a title that no other can take away from it. Now that we know that Mercury is the closest planet to Earth, the question we need to ask ourselves is, if it's the closest, why haven't we sent humans to Mercury? It's not for the reason you think. Many think that the reason we don't send spacecraft or crew of astronauts to Mercury is that it is hell, being so close to the Sun. But that's not the reason. In fact, Mercury's surface isn't much different from the Moon's, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to visit someday. The main reason we don't send humans or spacecraft to Mercury is that it's the hardest planet to reach. What? How is that Mercury is the closest planet to Earth and at the same time the planet that is most difficult to reach? If you want to know the answer to this contradiction, watch this video.